Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 39 of This Valorant Life. In this episode, Adam and I are getting into different aiming styles. Which one's better? Which one's worse? What are they even? And how do you adopt this to your gameplay? Should you switch? Should you not if you're one or the other? And so, with that, Adam, maybe can you help us identify what you think at least the first spectrum of aiming styles is?
Um, this one is kind of obvious, I think, when you actually play the game. But spraying, like being a heavy sprayer versus being like a more heavy like burst strafer or like a type of player, those are the two categories. And typically, people that have come from CS:GO lean on the side of spraying more. And then newer players that come into the game tend to burst or tap more. Because of that, we're kind of seeing two different evolutions of players, especially pro players in the game.
If you were to characterize players that fit into that kind of higher spraying category, who would they be?
Zekin's definitely the first one that comes to mind just because I've seen so many of his VODs
Hmm.
at this point. And Saucy as well. Saucy probably sprays at the most ridiculous ranges that I would ever see, and he converts them. And actually, I don't even know if Saucy played CSGO now that I think about it. I think he was a League of Legends pro. But, anyways, some other players that actually fit into that category, I would say, are FNS. He's notorious for actually just insta flick spraying, like he doesn't actually have aim discipline. You might have seen the platoon
I
video
watched the
that he
Platoon
did.
video.
So there's that. There's a few other CS players that's not coming to mind at the moment, but in that category you have that, and then on the tappy, bursty, burst strafer type of players, you have way more players in my opinion. The most popular ones are probably the MW Zera, like the Brazilian
Hmm.
community. So you have MW Zera, you have Aspas, you have
Hmm.
Less, and obviously when you're fighting them, it looks like they're dancing
Hmm.
almost.
Hmm.
So those are the two shooting styles with those type of players. Of course, some players are in the hybrid
Hmm.
middle. I would say Aspas sprays a little bit more than I would say MW Zera or Less would. Um, but yeah, those are the two extreme ends, I would say.
It's interesting that at that end of the spectrum, if you like really hold to it rigidly, even at close range, it's almost like an aesthetic. It's
Mm-hmm.
almost like I could get a kill by spraying, but I'm choosing not to. Uh, it's kind of like I could kill you easily, more easily, but I would rather not. I would rather do it with some swag.
Right. It's definitely strange.
Okay. Um, what's interesting for me is just even that Zekin is on that far end of that list because I think on the one hand you're trying to say, or you're saying that like on one end there's you know spray and more spray heavy, and then on this end more tappy headshot movement heavy. And we would also, I think, for most people, put on that spectrum like bad aimer, good aimer, right? Like
Hmm.
when we talk about some of the most dominant players in terms of just pure mechanical skill, they're mostly on that other end of the spectrum that is more tappy and headshotty, like Less or MW Zera or Yay. And then, by putting Sassy and FNS on the other end, it's kind of like, good and bad. And yet on that lower end is someone like Zekin, who is one of the best players in the world. Like how is it that he seems almost like an outlier on that end?
I think the first thing we need to definitely distinguish for Zekin specifically is he actually does have really good raw aim. If you've ever seen his posts on Twitter, he actually holds really good scores on some pretty difficult Kovac scenarios. The specific one, it's called floating dots, but I don't know the name of it specifically on this one. Basically, the dots just move across your screen like this, and you flick in front of it and click. Um, so he has like a top 10 or top 5 score on that, which is insane.
Okay.
So he has really good raw aim. In that scenario in particular, you're flicking, so you have to have really good flick landing, and you also need to be able to read moving
Yeah.
targets well. So both of those skills relates well into
Yes.
spraying, because if someone's on your screen and they're moving,
Yes.
normally you don't spray moving targets, but because he has this skill, his landing spot is actually very
Yes.
good, and now he actually can convert
I
that
see.
spray. So you take FNS on the other hand, maybe his initial flick is not as accurate, so he actually might not land that first bullet to hit the body shot. And now that enemy is moving a little bit quicker, and he's not going to be able to actually control the spray in this game compared to CS:GO.
Hmm.
Um, the other thing that goes into that too is Zekin is actually very quick with his flicks. So even if he misses a little bit, he actually might be able to reset if he wanted to go for another burst, depending on the fight, of course. Um, but I do think there's a little bit of raw aim that benefits him for that.
Okay.
And if you're number one really quick because TAC FPS time to kill is very
Yes.
low, and number two, you're pretty accurate. You actually might just be able to get the kill quicker spraying compared to trying to take that extra second or so or quarter second to line up a headshot.
Okay. And so, do you think it's fair then to say generally player with higher mechanical skill generally adopt the more tappy aspect, that more calm aim aspect of aiming? Um, Whereas it seems like the more spray heavy is more, other than maybe Zekin, which because of his other skills makes it work, is generally more of a hangover from a more CS:GO style of playing Valorant.
I want to say yes, but I can see the nuance. So I guess like the way I would word it is the spraying type of playstyle appears to be more forgiving for a player that has worse aim, and then they can still get the kill and secure the kill. But on the same note, if you go for the burst strafe type of playstyle and you miss your first shot, it's more forgiving because you have a chance to reset
Mm-hmm.
and try to aim
Mm-hmm.
again. So I can kind of see both ends of it. With Zekin in particular, the reason why it's his strength is because he is aiming at such a quick speed and such preciseness that his margin of actually getting the kill with the spray is pretty
Mm-hmm.
slim. But because he has the skill to pull it off, it
Mm-hmm.
works. Um, but I would say the general notion is what you're
Mm-hmm.
saying is like the burst strafers are the players with the better mechanical skill. And maybe the thing that actually differentiates that is not necessarily your aim, but just how comfortable you are with moving. Like maybe the reason why Zekin chooses this playstyle um, is because maybe he just doesn't like to do the moving back and forth as
Mm-hmm.
much. Who knows? It's definitely hard to say. In my experience, I'm a sprayer. I tend to spray a little bit more as well because I have like over 3,000 hours in CS, so that also kind of translated. But I have tried myself to play the burst strafe type of playstyle, and I just find that my time to kill is just a little bit
Mm-hmm.
longer than if I went for
Okay.
sprays. It also feels like it overcomplicates the situation.
Okay.
So yeah.
In my recent game, I think I was fighting uh Cubby on B to like B long, which is a long distance, like kind of through
Right.
octagon. And I just full sprayed like an entire phantom clip. Killed the guy with like the last shot on a headshot. I'm like, we were both just like sitting there like I was like, this is not good gunfight hygiene. But I'm already full pot committed. I feel like there's the other part of it, which is, for lack of a better word, I think sometimes, especially newer players or players that are getting into it, I feel like there's a phenomenon of, are you good at like holding your pee? Like there's this
Mm,
element of like, just when you full commit to spraying, you've released all your tension and you're just like, I'm in, whereas
right.
like I feel, because there's so much tension in this game, I feel like sometimes that's overwhelming and you just want to full commit. And I think contrast that with the tappy movement is you kind of always have to have some element of discipline. And so
Mm,
I don't know if it's discipline or like trust in your gun skill or just being more calm in general. I feel like that method reflects more control, whereas the other one reflects more able to just, release. And it would be an interesting thing because I wonder at the highest levels, like as you get further into a tournament, I wouldn't be surprised if we find more pros spray than when they do earlier in the tournament. Like as the stakes get higher, like I wouldn't be surprised that aim gets worse and people spray more. Kind of like I think they found in the NBA during the bubble, like during COVID, because there's no one in the stands. Um, Free throw percentages went up
mm, that's interesting.
because even for professionals, there's this mental aspect of not wanting to look bad. Whereas when there's no one in the stands, it just felt empty, right? So, um, the other thing we wanted to talk about was, so there's this spectrum of spray versus tapping. There's also a spectrum of, like, maybe on another axis of how you reset your mouse. Maybe walk us through your understanding of that, and we can talk about it a bit more, Adam.
just think about your typical high sense player, and or like your typical small, very isolated mouse pad space. A lot of people will reset their mouse by just picking it up with their wrist and putting it back down. And if you can kind of imagine this, actually, I can show the camera. Uh, like they're picking up their mouse like this. You don't have that much range of
Is that the
motion.
OP1?
This is the OP
Sorry.
one, yeah, which is why it's wired. I can't pull it any further. But your range of motion is small, so you actually won't be able to move that much. But you are always in a comfortable position once your mouse is reset to hit a micro flick, and that's the benefit of this. Some players that do this is Zekin again, and actually the player that ended rank one last act Knights. Now I haven't seen his mouse cam, but if you ever watch his games, his cursor or his crosshair just jumps and jumps and jumps. It's not very
Mm-hmm.
smooth. And then the other end of that is someone that instead of resetting with their wrist, they might just reset with their arm. So obviously with your arm, you have way more range of motion, and you can hold a more steady, smooth approach while you're tracking. And then once you reach the end of your range of motion, you'll just swipe the mouse and then reset it back to the center. So that will allow you to kind of, I guess, trace angles a little bit better, or if there's a target on your screen, you can track it. But I guess what we're trying to highlight here and the way it translates in game is as you're moving around the map and you're like, putting your crosshair on the wall, you're either resetting your mouse with your wrist constantly, or you're tracking the edge, and making sure your mouse pad or your mouse is on the mouse pad at all times. Um, and there's a lot of pros and cons to both, but I recognized after VOD reviewing that people play their reset differently and both to a high degree and a high level. So it's hard to say that one's better than the other.
If anyone's interested in seeing this more in depth, Ron Rambo Kim actually just had a video where he talked about this. I think it was titled Crosshair Placement, but it was actually more about, almost like mechanical mouse movement. And he called it smoothing versus like flick recentering. I think what's interesting though is that the flick recentering works in CS:GO and for Valorant because we're not a tracking game. And so as you're going around these corners, you don't have to track. That is part of the game mechanics, other than playing Neon, that make this different than an Overwatch or an Apex Legends or an Apex. Like, do you agree with that, or do you feel like that doesn't make sense for this game, Adam?
Oh, I do agree with that. I mean, tracking games, you have like you don't really have like heavy, like your bullets go where your crosshair goes. In Valorant, spray control is a little bit
Mm-hmm.
different. So I do think that's a good distinction. Something I wanted to add with the mouse reset type of thing is if your tracking aim is like one of your weaknesses, going the mouse like flick centering, recentering approach is probably better because now you're just relying on your flicks and your micro
Mm-hmm.
flicks for every single gun duel. And obviously, if someone swings on your screen and you're in the middle of picking up your mouse again, you're going to put it back down and just go for a
Mm-hmm.
flick because you don't even have time to actually track the head as it moves
Mm-hmm.
across your screen. So I do think that's another reason why you see this type of aim style compared to the other end, which of course Zekin does have really good raw
Mm-hmm.
aim. So that's why I personally thought it was a little bit curious that he went for that. I noticed the mouse resets, but yeah.
How do these different aim styles and different, let's say, mouse resetting styles, how do these align or not align with different styles of peaking or ways that people peak? Is one more aligned with more aggressively swinging corners? Is one more aligned with really, um, in a dedicated way, slicing the pie as players peak, kind of the way that a cryo or a yay plays? Where do these land on that spectrum?
I I don't know. Um, because I could see the wrist player or like the flick recentering player also peak angles really thoroughly. Like Zekin does a pretty good job of that. Um, but if I were to think abstractly about like someone that's not Zekin that would do that, they probably would just be more biased to wide
Mm-hmm.
swing instead of like, I guess smoothly approaching each
Mm-hmm.
angle. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I would assume that within the limitations of Valorant being a slower game, you are able to do both, no matter your flick recentering style. But the benefit of doing the arm smoothing thing is you have less blind spots, right? Because like obviously with the flick recentering, your mouse is going to be in the air
Mhm.
for a while, and you won't be able to flick as far with your wrist compared to your
Mhm.
arm. Which is another thing to note too. Zekin will actually use his arm if he needs
Mhm.
to. It's just that's not his
Mhm.
default.
If we're talking through pros and cons, I think the other one is that when you flick recenter, you have more blind spots. There's more gaps when it would be an inopportune time for someone to swing you.
Mm-hmm.
The other side of the coin is if you're on a smooth mouse reset and you're not picking up your arm very often, you may end up at the end. We've all had this where you kind of red line your range of motion. You're like this, and then you're like, oh, like, and you're like, I can't aim here. Like, and so if you're at the end of range of motion, we always feel super uncomfortable and you're way less accurate. Like
Mm-hmm.
there's way less, I think, modulation of your fine motor and your ability to control your mouse when you're at the end of range. And so you'll get less gaps and blind spots, but you will give that up when that happens.
I'm actually glad you brought that up because it popped up another idea in my mind, like with tension management. If you're flicking and resetting, you're effectively going from like tension to non-tension, tension to non-tension. But if you're doing the smooth approach, since you're kind of actively aiming the entire time, you have a little bit of tension the entire aiming journey, I suppose. And because of that, if you aren't trained in like relaxing your tension or increasing tension when you need to, it might be hard to kind of go between the spectrum when you're already in it, if that makes
Mhm.
sense.
I would say it's actually
Which
as you get, if you think about it, if you're taking your arm here and you're going that way, I think as you get to the end of range of motion, you're generally building like quite a bit of tension actually to get that
mm-hmm,
actual
mm-hmm.
like that last few centimeters at the end.
So if you think about it that way, like with the flick recentering playstyle, you're at your most comfortable position every time you recenter compared to the opposite. So you're putting yourself in the best position possible to aim, given that the target is relatively close to your
Mhm.
crosshair. Which in a game like Valorant and crosshair placement being so
Mhm.
important, and most of your fights are in front of
Mhm.
you, is why it's viable in this type of game compared to tracking heavy games.
So we're talking before we got on the show just around how players peak corners and how there are players that are super methodical around the peak corners, like a Yay or a Cryo. And you're talking about how there are some players that literally shift peak everything. Why is that working? That is kind of when you're getting into Valorant, that's kind of rule number one of not to do that. That would be like the low elo way to play the game. Why is it some high elo players, some radiant level players, one do it and are able to get away with it?
I wish I asked the pro and kind of knew more in their minds, but some of the inferences I can make is number one, maybe they only shift peak if they don't think that the enemy player expects them and they're just trying to get better timing. Because obviously, if you do a lot of tight peaks and you're more methodical, you're going to take slightly longer, and it's like adds
Mm,
up over the course of all those peaks. You are adding up more time into it. I think the other thing too is if you have like angle advantage, then technically, even if you shift peak, you'll still see the target first. So that's okay to do if you have angle advantage. But like if you go the extreme end, if you're like right up against the wall and you shift peak out, of course you're going to die. And we don't see pros do
mm,
that. Typically you'll see like pros shift peak when they're like mid to long range,
okay.
further away from cover. Um, but the other element of it is like I don't know. Like personally, when I watch it, it feels bad. Like it just doesn't make sense to me. But I see it time and time again from these pros, and I can't name like any specific ones because it seems that for that to be the default, and for the Yay and the crowd to be the outliers.
Maybe it's just that level of, I wonder if it's just that level of attention to detail is just really hard to keep up when you're playing multiple ranked games a day.
Mm,
Like if you watch them play to play with that amount of methodology or rigor in your peaking just looks a little exhausting.
It definitely does. I mean, generally when you peak, like a dedicated peak, you want to peak with the intent to kill. So if you think about it from that sense, you're like peaking with the intent to kill like many, many, many times in like a course of 5 seconds, compared to if you shift peak like the off angles and then peak the on angle, you really only have to do it one time in those five
Mhm.
seconds. Which I should mention, the pros will not shift peak common angles. They will actually
Mhm.
do the dedicated peaks on the common angles most of the
Hmm.
time.
Hmm. I wonder also, there's, I forget where I was reading it or what the study was, but over the day, your willpower wanes. Like we kind of know that you get tired, but at a real physiological level, when you make a lot of decisions, there's a particular, I think it's a protein that builds up in your brain that prevents you from wanting to do more. And I wonder if it's that a little bit too, is if you're constantly needing to put it that high level, like you're actually inherently limiting how much you can play. I think pros can maybe turn, I wonder if pros turn that on more when they're playing in high consequence games and kind of turn it down when they're playing in more low consequence games.
I also wonder if it has anything to do with tournament environment. Like maybe the crowd cells in Yay, the reason why they might perform better at a LAN tournament is because if you were to, because holding angles is so much more powerful at LAN, that you have to actually be really intent
Mm,
on peeking every single thing, and you can't get away with shift peeking as
mm,
much. And maybe in online, you can get away with it
because
more.
of Peaker's
I don't
advantage.
know. Yeah, I wonder.
I guess all of this discussion around aiming and style kind of revolves around, for most players at least, what's best? Which one should I do so I can release my inner ass pass? If I were to
Mm.
just change my mouse resetting style and my mouse grip and my sends and my monitor and my aiming and my like tappy headshot style, then I'll just be like ass pass, right? Like when you think about that, is there a reason for people to change? Or is it more just noticing which one you are?
There are definitely cases where it makes sense to change your shooting style. Let's just pull up FNS, for example. He probably would benefit from having a little bit more discipline and not just instant spraying.
But maybe there's not enough
Now,
room in that gigabrain with all of the five head strats he's calling
ideally,
to fit any
yeah.
more, changes.
I mean, yeah, his T set is really good. Um, I think like if I were to outline what I think is the most ideal practical, I would say you want an aim style that is more tappy and bursty,
Yes.
so you can stay mobile. You would want to reset your mouse using your arm and do the more smooth approach. And you would also want to be very methodical in your angle clearing, like a Yay and Crowell cells. But I think that really probably only matters for like the top very small percentage, like probably not even the top 1%, like probably like, I don't know, top 100 pros or top 50
Yeah.
pros for that to really matter. Like you're like top 10 duelists in the world, maybe that starts to matter. I'm not actually sure. Um, but I don't think we're in the stage of the game yet where these are the factors that are important for the average player base. I think you could probably do the opposite end of what I said. You could spray a lot. That's your shooting style. You could shift peak a lot and only dedicated peak the common angles. And you could reset your mouse with your wrist and just get away. You could probably do all those three things and be a really good. You could be a radiant level player. You could be a pro player because I'm sure. I mean, sorry FNS, but probably FNS probably fills those last three buckets, and he's obviously a
Hmm.
pro. And if you look at a bunch of other pros, like they probably fill those three buckets too. So I think if it's not working, whatever you're doing, it's just not working. Like you just immediately crotch pay people and you're losing your fight, and you're recognizing that this is a common pattern for me to lose fights. Maybe you should adjust your shooting style.
Mm.
Or maybe if you reset your mouse with the wrist all the time and you like to play low sense, that's probably not going to work
Yeah.
as well. And so maybe you should go the opposite. Um, or what was the last one? The peaking. If you find that you just die instantly every single time you peak stuff, maybe you can try being a little bit more dialed in. Or if you feel like you can't just peek around the map, maybe because you're in a sentinel in a controller role and you find you can find more timings, then you probably don't need to change
Hmm.
that aspect of your gameplay.
Do you think for most players, Adam, their shooting style, do you think the shooting style that they kind of naturally are inclined towards, does it show up in DMs in low consequence or low intensity environments? Or does it only kind of show up in ranked matches?
Oh, I think I see what you're saying. Like people in deathmatch tend to shoot a certain way, and it's a little bit different than how they shoot in ranked
I think
games.
you. you don't see as many players spraying in deathmatch, and I think it's because the
Mm-hmm.
tension is lower, and so they don't full commit. Whereas you see it like a reasonable, like you almost don't see it when you do it in the game, but you certainly notice when your teammate just full on commits a full spray long range, and you're like, well, it's probably not going to win them the fight, and then they die, right? And I
Right.
wonder how much of it is that your true aiming style gets kind of more revealed under pressure.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. I don't know if I fully agree with that because I feel like most people would probably fall into that.
Sure.
Um, like maybe that's what makes an ASPAS and MWZ stand out so much
Mm.
is because they can hold in their P for longer. um, but yeah, I don't know. It's one of those things that I wish there was a definitive answer to because, like a lot of you guys, I do tend to look at these things and cope. That's probably why we're talking about it. Is like, it's just another one of those factors that we can talk
Yeah.
about. In reality, it doesn't matter that much. And the more that I learned about Valorant is like, it really doesn't matter all that
Mm.
much. You could probably get to Radiant with like a 15 to 20% headshot. Um, I mean, Sinatra's done it,
Hmm. Hmm.
but it's definitely unique to his playstyle.
Hmm.
So yeah, strange.
What would be your takeaway from this episode then?
Um, I don't know. um, the I think obvious answer that I would tell someone else would be don't overthink it and just like try to understand what type of player you are in these type of categories so you can recognize it. And if it starts to become a weakness, then you can try to address it. But also it might just be better to lean into your strengths and accept the weaknesses.
Hmm.
And I do think a lot of pro players have done that. Like if we go down another topic, which is posture, you'll see a lot of pro players have very strange posture, especially CS players back in the day, just because they had a lot less
Hmm.
space and the keyboard's
Hmm.
tilted and like all of those stuff. Like they have to adapt to their conditions, and there's a lot more minuses than benefits, but it's comfortable, and with enough time, you can get better, even with the you know discomfort. So
I wonder if
yeah.
it's more that it's helpful to understand these different styles. That stylistically, if you're inclined one way, it's totally fine for you to stay that way or to try to change your style. But I think ultimately coming out of this conversation, you can be successful with anyone with any of them. The things that are holding you back probably have much less to do with this and your aiming style and much more to do with, do you make good decisions? Do you calm well? Are you peaking with correct technique? Um, do you play numbers up, numbers down situations appropriately? And do you look at your mini map enough, right? Like the
Yeah.
fundamentals, the aiming style is nice, and I think if you have that crispy aiming style, it gives you more, maybe more potential for clips. But ultimately, if we're just talking about winning games and ranking up, it's not going to be the most important thing. It's probably at the very top of the pyramid. It's definitely not your foundation.
It reminds me of what I believe you told me about this with Tiger Woods and his golf grip or something like that, or his golf swing. Like he was already like a really good player, but then he had to like reinvent himself to be the very best. And maybe for, I mean, probably everyone listening, that isn't important to us because
Yes.
like we have to reach the limits of our current style before we think about changing it. Like maybe that's something for Zekin to consider now that he's at the
Yeah.
top. Maybe he'll consider switching from spraying to bursting a little bit more.
I think it was
And
he
his mouse
changed
reset.
from, this is dorky. I'm pretty sure this is an interlock grip because you interlock these two, and then I think he switched to a Varden grip, which is like you overlap. I think,
Oh,
if I remember correctly, from my Golf Geek days.
I
Yep.
see. So yeah.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Genuinely, we are closer to launching the community than ever before. which is to say
True.
we're a tiny bit closer. Thank you for joining us. I hope this discussion was interesting to you as it was for us. Thank you for supporting the show, and have a great day.
Bye bye.